The summons. The Twilight Accord had governed 17 species across 43 star systems for 3,000 cycles, and in all that time, no one had ever raised their voice in the Judgment Chamber. Ambassador Cassian Drift stood before the obsidian doors, adjusting the collar of his diplomatic coat. The fabric was earth-made, midnight blue with silver threading that caught the alien sun's purple light. Beside him, his aide Mira Castellane clutched a data tablet that contained their entire defense. "They'll expect you to answer in under 60 seconds, Mira whispered, her bronze skin paling slightly. "The Catherine protocol is absolute. 60 seconds or immediate judgment." Cassian smiled, the expression not reaching his steel-gray eyes. "Then it's fortunate I've been practicing talking fast." The doors opened without sound, revealing a chamber that seemed to swallow light itself. The 17 adjudicators sat in tiered circles rising into shadow, each representing their species' highest authority. At the apex sat Executor Valesh, a being of crystalline geometry whose body refracted thoughts into visible light. Human delegation. Valesh's voice resonated through the chamber, bypassing ears entirely and manifesting directly in the mind. "You stand accused of 73 violations of the colonial expansion protocols. The testimony has been heard. You may offer defense. You have 1 standard minute." The chamber's walls began to pulse with a soft crimson glow. The timer had started. Cassian stepped forward. "Thank you, Executor. Before I begin my defense, I'd like to establish context. You see, humanity has a peculiar relationship with time that I believe is relevant to these proceedings." "Irrelevant," chimed Adjudicator Thorex, a quadrupedal being whose translator orb glowed amber. "Address the charges." "I am addressing them," Cassian continued smoothly, "because the charges themselves rest on a fundamental misunderstanding of human behavior, which can only be understood through the lens of our evolutionary development. We evolved on a planet with a 24-hour rotational period, which affected our circadian rhythms in ways that— 30 seconds remain, Valesh announced, the crimson glow intensifying. Myra's knuckles whitened on her tablet. This wasn't the defense they'd prepared. This was something else entirely. "Which brings me to the concept of persistence hunting," Cassian said, his pace increasing ever so slightly. "You see, early humans didn't have the speed or strength of their prey. What they had was endurance. They would chase an animal for hours, sometimes days, until the creature collapsed from exhaustion. This trait became embedded in our psychology, our culture, our very way of approaching problems. We don't stop. We don't yield. And most relevant to these proceedings." "Time expired," Valesh declared. The crimson glow snapped to black. "The defense is insufficient. We shall now deliberate." "I invoke the right of complete testimony," Cassian said clearly. The chamber fell into absolute silence. Even the soft hum of the translator orbs ceased. Adjudicator ZUX-9, a being of living mercury, spoke for the first time. "That right has not been invoked in 2,000 cycles. It is archaic. Barbaric. But legal," Cassian replied. "According to the founding covenants of the Twilight Accord, Article 7, Section 12, any accused party may invoke the right of complete testimony, allowing them to speak without interruption or time limit until they themselves declare their testimony complete." Myra's eyes widened. She'd never seen this in their legal archives. How had Cassian found it? Valesh's crystalline form darkened, colors swirling like an angry storm. This right was created for species whose neural patterns required extended periods to formulate coherent thought. It was meant for beings who communicate through generations of chemical exchange or geological timescales. "The covenant makes no species restriction," Cassian said. "And as a member species of the Accord, humanity is entitled to invoke any legal protection available. Unless the Executor is suggesting that humans should have fewer rights than other member species." The trap was sprung and every being in the chamber recognized it. Valesh's colors stabilized, shifting to a resigned deep blue. "The right of complete testimony is granted. Speak your defense, human. And know that from this moment until you declare your testimony complete, you may not leave this chamber, you may not eat, you may not sleep, and you may not be interrupted by any force in this accord." Cassian's smile widened. "Thank you, Executor. Then let me begin at the beginning. It was a dark and stormy night, or rather, it was the Earth year 2247, and humanity had just achieved stable faster-than-light travel." Mira suddenly understood. This wasn't just a defense. This was a filibuster. And Cassian Drift had no intention of stopping anytime soon. The history lesson. Hour 3 of Cassian Drift's testimony found the judgment chamber in a state of unprecedented confusion. And you must understand, Cashin continued, pacing slowly before the adjudicators, that the invention of the printing press in 1440 by Johannes Gutenberg fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with information dissemination, which directly relates to why we established colony oversight committees rather than centralized control structures on our expansion worlds. Adjudicator though Rex shifted uncomfortably on his four legs. Executor, surely we can? The right of complete testimony permits no interruption, Valish reminded him, colors muted with what might have been exhaustion. We invoked this upon ourselves by granting his request. Mira Castellane sat in the designated aide position, a small alcove near the chamber entrance. She'd started taking notes but had long since given up. Cashin had moved from faster-than-light travel to medieval Europe without seeming to notice the transition himself. Yet somehow, improbably, he was still technically talking about the colonial violations. The printing press led to the Renaissance, Cashin explained, gesturing expansively, which sparked the age of exploration, which established the psychological framework for how humans approach new frontiers. When we reached the colony world of Verdant Reach, charge number 7 in your documents, Executor, we didn't impose a unified government because our history taught us that diversity of thought drives innovation. The printing press proved that. The Renaissance proved that. ZYX9's mercury form rippled with agitation. This human mocks us. No, said Adjudicator Serene, a being of pure energy contained in a magnetic field. He's actually building an argument. A very, very long argument. Indeed, Mira realized with growing admiration, Cashin was threading a needle. Every seemingly random tangent connected back to one of the 73 charges. He just did so in the most circuitous, time-consuming way possible. Now, the Protestant Reformation of 1517, Cashin continued, introduced concepts of individual interpretation of doctrine, which parallels why we allowed the Verdant Reach colonies to develop 17 different mining safety protocols rather than enforcing a single standard, as Charge 14 suggests we should have done. A soft chime echoed through the chamber. Valish's colors shifted to surprise. First meal cycle. The chamber will pause for. The right of complete testimony permits no pause, Cashin reminded him gently. The covenant is quite clear on this point, Executor. No interruption by any force in this accord includes procedural requirements. Valish's crystalline structure dimmed. You cannot expect us to remain here indefinitely. I expect nothing, Executor. I'm simply exercising my legal rights while providing a thorough, contextual defense of humanity's actions. These charges deserve nothing less than complete transparency and historical context. Thorax's translator orb flickered with suppressed anger. How long do you intend to speak, human? Cashin paused as if considering the question carefully. Well, I've covered roughly 400 years of human history so far. Humanity has approximately 12,000 years of recorded history, and I believe all of it provides relevant context for our colonial decisions. So, mathematically speaking. He trailed off with an apologetic shrug. The implications crashed through the chamber like a shockwave. Days, ZX9 whispered. He means to keep us here for days. At minimum, Serene added, a note of horrified respect in their voice. Mira fought to keep her expression neutral, but inside she was recalculating everything she thought she knew about Cashin Drift. He'd been appointed as Earth's ambassador to the Twilight Accord only 6 months ago, replacing the previous ambassador who'd resigned in disgrace after 3 failed negotiations. Everyone thought Cashin was a placeholder, a junior diplomat who'd merely keep the seat warm. They'd been so wrong. The 30 Years' War began in 1618, Cashin continued seamlessly, and while it seems like a purely European conflict, the treaties that ended it, the Peace of Westphalia, established principles of sovereignty and non-interference that became foundational to how humanity approaches multi-settlement governance, which directly addresses charges 22 through 37 regarding our refusal to intervene in the Kepler station disputes. Valish's colors cycled rapidly through spectrums invisible to human eyes, a sign Mira had learned meant deep processing. Finally the executor spoke. Ambassador Drift, perhaps we might discuss a recess? The adjudicators could deliberate on what you've presented so far. A recess would invalidate my testimony under the covenant, Cashin replied. Article 7, Section 12, subsection C states that testimony must be continuous. Any break exceeding 5 minutes renders the right void, and we return to the 60-second limitation. 5 minutes, Thorex said quickly. Then we shall take a 5-minute recess every what? Cashin interrupted, his voice still polite but edged with steel. Every hour? I've been speaking for 3 hours. That would give us 15 minutes of break time so far. Hardly sufficient for the adjudicators to receive sustenance, much less deliberate. Every 6 hours? The math becomes problematic. The covenant's framers anticipated this issue, which is why the right of complete testimony was designed for beings who don't experience time linearly. They never imagined someone would weaponize it. Weaponize? Vailesh repeated slowly. A figure of speech, Cashin said with disarming innocence. Now where was I? Yes, the Peace of Westphalia. The treaty recognized the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion, which established that local authorities should determine local practices. As Cashin dove into 17th century theology, Mira noticed something. The other species representatives in the observers' gallery, members of the media, diplomatic staff, curious citizens of various worlds, were beginning to arrive in greater numbers. Word was spreading. A human was holding the entire judgment chamber hostage with nothing but his voice. And somewhere in the galaxy she knew humanity was watching. Waiting. Hoping that Cashin Drift could talk them out of the harshest sentence the Twilight Accord had ever contemplated. He had to keep talking for as long as it took. And knowing Cashin, Mira realized with a smile, that was exactly what he'd do. The fatigue sets in. Hour 18 marked the first collapse. Adjudicator Thorex, the quadrupedal being whose species required sleep cycles every 16 hours, simply folded his legs beneath him and sank into unconsciousness. His translator orb dimmed but continued to relay Cashin's words directly to his subconscious, a peculiarity of the chamber's design that no one had ever considered problematic before. And the Industrial Revolution, beginning in approximately 1760, transformed humanity's relationship with labor and production, Cashin continued, his voice showing remarkable stamina. This is crucial to understanding charges 41 through 45 regarding our mining operations on Threshold Prime. You see, we learned from the mistakes of early industrialization, child labor, unsafe working conditions, environmental devastation, and built those lessons into our colonial framework. Mira handed him another glass of water, their fourth exchange of the hour. It was one of the few interactions permitted under the right of complete testimony. An aide could provide sustenance, but only if the speaker didn't pause their testimony. Cashin had mastered the art of drinking while talking, though the effect was somewhat absurd. Vailesh's crystalline form had shifted to a dull gray, the color of exhaustion. Ambassador, surely you've made your point? I'm only up to the 19th century, Cashin replied, wiping his mouth. We still have the world wars, the space age, the climate crisis, the unification wars, first contact, the diaspora. Each of these periods fundamentally shaped how humanity approaches colonization. To omit any of them would be to present an incomplete defense. ZX-9 had abandoned their formal position and pooled in their designated space like liquid metal in a bowl. This is torture. This is due process, Cashin corrected gently. And I assure you I'm suffering as much as anyone. My throat is raw, my legs ache, and I'd very much like to sit down. But the right of complete testimony doesn't permit sitting. Another oversight by the Covenant's framers. Serene pulsed with dim energy. You're making a mockery of this chamber. I'm exercising my rights, Cashin said, and for the first time, his voice carried an edge. The same rights that were freely used by other species for thousands of cycles. The same rights that were used just 200 cycles ago by the Nethrek delegation to avoid sanctions for their unauthorized terraforming projects. They spoke for 6 days straight, until the adjudicators agreed to reduce their penalties. The only difference is that no one expected a human to be capable of such endurance. That landed like a hammer blow. The Nethrek case was legendary, a precedent that had never been challenged because it was assumed no species would attempt such a feat again. But humans, as Cashin was proving, were excellent at persistence. The Victorian era, he continued, named for Queen Victoria of England who reigned from 1837 to 1901, saw massive colonial expansion by European powers. The atrocities committed during this period, the exploitation, the cultural destruction, the genocides, became a dark mirror that humanity was forced to confront. When we reached the stars, we carried those scars with us. That's why Charge 52, which accuses us of cultural interference in the Zenith settlements, fundamentally misunderstands our intent. In the observers' gallery, the crowd had grown to standing room only. News feeds from across the Accord were streaming the proceedings live. What had started as a minor diplomatic incident was becoming the most watched event in decades. A young Kethran reporter, her scales shimmering with excitement, whispered into her recording device, "Hour 18 and Ambassador Drift shows no signs of stopping. Some adjudicators have lapsed into sleep, Others appear catatonic. But the human continues, his voice steady, his arguments flowing like an endless river. This isn't just a defense, it's a demonstration of human endurance that challenges everything we thought we knew about them. Mira caught snippets of the galactic reaction on her data tablet. Social networks were exploding. Betting pools had formed on how long Cashin could continue. Memes were circulating, images of Cashin's face superimposed on historical human marathoners, endurance swimmers, ultra-runners. But more importantly, public opinion was shifting. Maybe the humans have a point, read one popular post. If their ambassador can do this without augmentation or stimulants, just imagine what their colonists can accomplish. Another, we've been judging humans by our standards. Perhaps we should judge them by their own. Hour 20 brought the second collapse. Adjudicator Krell, a being whose species existed partially out of phase with normal time, simply flickered out of existence. They'd remain gone for approximately 48 hours before remanifesting, a stress response their biology couldn't prevent. The world wars of the 20th century, Cashin said, his voice growing slightly hoarse but no less determined, killed over 100 million humans. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 demonstrated that humanity had achieved the power to destroy itself. That knowledge, that existential terror, became embedded in how we approach expansion. We don't seek to dominate. We seek to survive. Together. That's why charges 58 through 63 regarding our defense installations are actually about mutual protection, not aggression. Vailesh's colors swirled with something that might have been respect, might have been anger, might have been both. You planned this from the beginning. It wasn't a question, but Cashin answered anyway. I prepared for every contingency, Executor. That's what good diplomats do. Though I confess I hoped we wouldn't need to resort to this. But when you face 73 charges that could result in humanity's expulsion from the Accord, the loss of all our colonies, and the potential isolation of Earth itself, well, desperate times call for desperate measures. And if you collapse? ZUX9 asked. If your biology fails? Cashin smiled, and there was something fierce in it. Then humanity will know we fought until the very end. And that, adjudicators, is the most human thing of all. Hour 24 arrived like a milestone. A full day. Cashin Drift had been speaking continuously for 24 hours, covering 7 centuries of human history, tying each event to multiple charges, building a defense that was simultaneously brilliant and maddening in its thoroughness. In his office on Earth, Director Chin of the Diplomatic Corps watched the feed with tears in his eyes. That magnificent bastard, he whispered. He's actually doing it. And in the judgment chamber, Cashin Drift reached the year 1969. On July 20, 1969, he said, a human named Neil Armstrong became the first person to set foot on Luna, Earth's moon. His first words were, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. He was wrong, of course. It was a giant leap from the very beginning. But that humility, that understanding that great achievements are built on countless small steps, that's what humanity brings to the Accord. And that's why these charges, each and every one, represent not violations but steps. The chamber waited. The galaxy watched. And Cashin Drift kept talking. The breaking point. Hour 36 brought hallucinations. Not for Cashin, not yet, but for Adjudicator Vaelesh, whose crystalline matrix began projecting fractured rainbow patterns across the chamber walls. The Executor's species required deep meditation every 28 hours to process accumulated sensory data. Without it, their thoughts began to bleed into visible light. The Apollo 13 mission of 1970 demonstrated humanity's problem-solving under pressure, Cashin continued, though his voice had roughened to gravel. His lips were cracked. His eyes were bloodshot. But he stood straight and his words remained clear. When an oxygen tank exploded, stranding 3 astronauts in space, the phrase, failure is not an option, became legendary. Engineers on the ground worked for 4 days straight to bring them home. No sleep. No breaks. Just pure, stubborn determination. This relates directly to charges 67 through 70 regarding our emergency protocols on the frontier stations. Stop, Vaelesh whispered, colors bleeding together in swirls of confusion. Please. But the right of complete testimony allowed no mercy. Mira watched Cashin with growing concern. She'd managed to slip him stimulant patches during water exchanges, mild ones, barely more than caffeine, but strictly speaking illegal under the Covenant's provision that testimony be given without artificial enhancement of faculties. If they were discovered, it would invalidate everything. But Cashin had calculated this risk too. The definition of artificial enhancement, has never been tested, he told her during their preparation, back when she thought this was all theoretical. Does it include water? Food? The chair beneath an adjudicator? Where do we draw the line between natural and artificial? And more importantly, who wants to spend another 6 hours debating that while I continue talking? He'd been right. No one had challenged the stimulant patches. No one wanted to prolong this any further. Hour 40 brought a strange shift in the observers' gallery. The crowd had evolved from spectators to participants. They'd organized shifts, with different species taking turns to witness and record. Food vendors had appeared outside the chamber. Betting pools had grown into complex prediction markets. Cultural analysts were publishing real-time papers on what they were calling the drift phenomenon. And most surprisingly, public sentiment had swung decisively in humanity's favor. He's been talking for 40 hours, a Catherine commentator said into the galactic feed. 40 hours of human history, human mistakes, human triumphs. And you know what? I understand them now. I understand why they organize their colonies the way they do. Why they make the decisions that seem so strange to us. This human isn't just defending his species, he's teaching us about them. Another commentator, a Velok whose species were known for their brevity, the accord moves too fast. We make judgments in minutes that should take days. Perhaps the humans have reminded us what thorough deliberation looks like. In the chamber, though Rex had awakened, looking disoriented and ashamed, Krell remained phased out. 3 more adjudicators had entered states of semi-consciousness, their species' biological requirements overriding their duties. Only 7 adjudicators remained fully aware. And Vailesh, whose responsibility as executor made leaving unthinkable. The Vietnam War, Cashin said, and something in his tone had changed. The history lesson continued, but now there was an undercurrent of steel. A conflict that tore humanity apart from the 1950s through 1975. It taught us that overwhelming force doesn't guarantee victory. That hearts and minds matter. That colonization without consent is doomed to failure. When we're accused in Charge 71 of allowing excessive autonomy in our settlements, you're actually describing our learned wisdom. We don't impose because imposition fails. Vailesh's colors stabilized slightly. The executor was fighting through the meditation deprivation, recognizing something important in Cashin's shift. You're no longer just buying time, Vailesh observed. I never was just buying time, Cashin replied. Executor, with respect, you all made a critical error. You assumed this trial was about judging humanity's actions. But it was always about making you understand those actions. The accord doesn't need to punish us. It needs to know us. ZUX9 rippled with renewed interest. And 40 hours of history accomplishes this? Yes, Cashin said simply. Because you can't judge choices without understanding the chooser. Every violation you cited makes perfect sense once you understand where we came from. The restrictions we refused to implement? We tried those on Earth and watched them fail. The freedoms we insisted on preserving? We know what happens when they're lost. The protocols we modified? We've refined them through 12,000 years of trial and error. He paused to drink water, and Mira saw his hand trembling. How much longer could he last? The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Cashin continued. For 28 years, it divided a city, a nation, a world. When it finally came down, humanity relearned a lesson we'd forgotten. That division is expensive. More expensive than unity. More dangerous than cooperation. This lesson, this hard-won wisdom, is why we structured our colonial governments to resist centralization. Why we built redundancies. Why we seem chaotic to you, because we learned that overly rigid systems break, and when they break, people die. Hour 48 arrived like a judgment itself. 2 full days. Cashin Drift had been standing, speaking, for 2 complete rotations of Earth, covering centuries of history, connecting each thread to the charges against humanity. His legs wobbled. His voice cracked. But his eyes remained clear. Ambassador, Vailesh said quietly, you've made your point. We understand. We see. You may conclude your testimony. No, Cashin said. Not yet. Why? Serene asked, their energy field dimming with exhaustion. What more can you possibly say? Cashin smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd crossed a desert and found it shorter than expected. Because we're not to the good part yet, adjudicator. We're not to first contact. We're not to the moment humanity looked up at the stars and realized we weren't alone. We're not to the treaty signings, the cultural exchanges, the partnerships. We're not to the part where humanity joined the Twilight Accord and promised to be better neighbors than we'd been to each other. He steadied himself, drawing on reserves that shouldn't exist. We're not to the 73 charges, he continued, and the honest explanation of why each one happened. Not excuses. Not justifications. Just truth. And the truth, adjudicators, takes time. Mira felt tears on her face. The gallery had gone completely silent. Even the external feeds seemed to hold their collective breath. Vailish's colors cycled through the full spectrum and settled on something like silver, respect, in the executor's visual language. Then speak your truth, Ambassador Drift, Vailish said. We will listen. And Cashin Drift, with 48 hours of continuous testimony already given, smiled and continued his story. The truth emerges. Hour 60 marked a transformation. Cashin Drift's voice had long since given up any pretense of smoothness. It was raw, cracked, barely above a rasp. But paradoxically, this made every word hit harder. This was no longer diplomatic polish. This was bedrock honesty carved out by exhaustion. First contact, Cashin said, and the chamber leaned in despite themselves. The year 2247. The Velox scout ship detected our FTL signature near Proxima Centauri. We thought we were alone in the universe. We were wrong. And everything changed. He paused for water and Mira noticed something. His hands had stopped shaking. Past a certain point of exhaustion, the body either collapsed or found a strange, transcendent calm. Cashin had reached that place. Humanity's reaction to first contact reveals everything you need to know about charges 1 through 15, he continued. We panicked. Every nation, every faction, every ideological group had a different response. Some wanted to retreat to Earth and fortify. Others wanted to rush outward and claim as much territory as possible before meeting you again. And a small group, the group that eventually formed the Colonial Initiative, argued for something radical, that we should meet you as partners, not competitors. Vailish's colors had stabilized to a steady blue, focused attention. We remember. Your delegation was chaotic. We were terrified, Cashin corrected. 3,000 years you've been out here building the Accord. We'd barely left our solar system. The power imbalance was staggering. But we made a choice. We chose vulnerability over dominance. We chose to join rather than conquer or cower. And that choice, Executor, is why every single charge against us deserves to be understood, not just judged. For the first time since the testimony began, Cashin moved from his standing position. He approached the adjudicator's tiered circle slowly, his gait stiff but deliberate. Charge 1, he said, and his voice carried the weight of 60 hours without rest. Failure to implement standardized governance protocols across human colonies. You called this administrative chaos. We call it distributed resilience. Let me explain why. What followed was not a history lesson but a confession. The colony on Verdant Reach, our first extrasolar settlement, was established by 3,000 volunteers from 42 Earth nations. They brought their cultures, their languages, their governing traditions. We could have imposed a single system. We chose not to. Because we remembered the unification wars on Earth, when we tried to force humanity into a single mold. 70 million died in those wars, Executor. 70 million. And we learned that diversity isn't weakness, it's survival. Thorex, now fully awake and attentive, spoke up. But diverse systems create inefficiency. They create redundancy, Cashin countered. When Verdant Reach was hit by the Cascade Plague in 2251, 17 different colonies had 17 different approaches to treatment. 16 failed. One succeeded, a small settlement that used traditional quarantine methods combined with experimental gene therapy. If we'd had a standardized protocol, all 17 colonies would have used the same approach. All 17 would have failed. And 3,000 humans would have died. The chamber absorbed this. In the observer's gallery, furious note-taking. That's one charge, ZUX9 said. You have 72 more. Then let's continue, Cashin said. Charge 2, unauthorized terraforming operations on Threshold Prime. What unfolded over the next 12 hours was unprecedented. Cashin went through each charge methodically, stripping away excuses, revealing not justifications but explanations. He spoke of mistakes made and owned. He spoke of calculated risks that failed. He spoke of success stories that looked like violations through the Accord's lens but were triumphs through humanity's. Charge 28, he said, his voice barely a whisper now. Failure to report the Kepler Station rebellion to Accord authorities. You're right. We didn't report it. Do you know why? Silence. Because it wasn't a rebellion. It was a labor negotiation. The miners on Kepler Station demanded better safety equipment and profit sharing. The colonial administration refused. The miners went on strike. By your protocols, we should have reported this as an insurrection and requested military intervention. Instead, we mediated. The miners got their equipment and a 30% profit share. Productivity increased by 50%. No one died. No one was imprisoned. And humanity learned, again, that the people doing the work usually know what they need better than the people giving orders. Hour 72 passed. 3 full days. Cashin had covered 65 charges with a brutal honesty that left the adjudicators reeling. This wasn't a defensive filibuster anymore. It was a masterclass in diplomatic transparency. But it was killing him. Mira could see it now. The stimulant patches weren't working anymore. His body was consuming itself for fuel. His legs trembled constantly. His eyes had sunken into dark hollows. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Ambassador Drift, Valish said, and for the first time, there was genuine concern in the executor's voice. You should rest. We've heard enough. 7 more charges, Cashin interrupted. Just 7 more. Then I'll conclude. You could die, Serene said flatly. Cashin smiled, and it was beatific. Humans have died for less worthy causes. But I won't die today. I'll finish this. Because that's what we do. We finish what we start. Charge 66, 67, 68. Each explanation more raw than the last. Each revelation stripping away another layer of misunderstanding between humanity and the Accord. Charge 71, Cashin said, and now he was swaying. Excessive autonomy granted to frontier settlements. You believe we abandoned our people. Let me tell you what really happened. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, everyone thought he'd finally collapsed. But then he opened them again, and they were bright with an almost feverish intensity. The frontier settlements chose their autonomy. We didn't grant it, we respected it. These were people who traveled 30 light years to build new lives. They left Earth specifically to escape centralized control. And we learned, centuries ago, that you can't build a free society by forcing people to be free in the exact way you specify. So yes, we gave them autonomy. We gave them the right to succeed or fail on their own terms. And most of them succeeded beyond our wildest projections. Hour 75. Cashin reached the final charge. Charge 73, he whispered. Refusal to submit to Accord military oversight of human defense installations. This is the big one, isn't it? The one that really scared you. Valish's colors flickered. Yes. We refused, Cashin said, because we've seen what happens when a central authority controls all military force. We've lived through those dark chapters. And we promised ourselves, promised humanity, that we would never again put all our security in one entity's hands. Not Earth's. Not the Accord's. Not anyone's. Our defense installations answer to the colonies they protect. That's not defiance. That's learned wisdom bought with blood. He paused, swaying dangerously. And if that makes us unacceptable to the Accord, he continued, then we'll leave. We'll maintain our friendships, our trade agreements, our cultural exchanges. But we'll leave. Because some prices are too high to pay even for acceptance. The chamber went utterly still. Cashin Drift had just delivered an ultimatum wrapped in 75 hours of exhaustive testimony. He'd explained, defended, and owned every charge. And then he'd drawn a line. My testimony, he said softly, is complete. And he collapsed. The verdict's edge. Cashin Drift woke in the medical bay, which was technically a violation of the right of complete testimony's provision that the speaker remain in the chamber until deliberation concluded. But as he opened his eyes to see Myra's worried face hovering over him, he realized he didn't care. How long? He croaked. 4 hours, Myra said, offering him water through a straw. You collapsed. They declared a medical emergency, and invoked the emergency care exception to move you here. The adjudicators are deliberating now. 4 hours is enough for them to decide our fate, Cashin observed, trying to sit up and failing. His body felt like it belonged to someone else. The medical AI says you'll need 3 days to fully recover, Myra reported. You pushed your body beyond reasonable limits. Another 12 hours and you would have suffered permanent damage. But I didn't, Cashin smiled weakly. I lasted long enough. You spoke for 75 hours straight, Cashin. That's not normal even for humans. None of this was normal, he replied. That was rather the point. Through the medical bay's transparent wall, Cashin could see the chaos outside. The station corridor was packed with representatives from every member species, media crews, and what looked like protesters with signs. They're arguing, Myra explained, following his gaze. About half the Accord's population thinks you're a hero who exposed flaws in our legal system. The other half thinks you're a manipulator who made a mockery of sacred protocols. And the adjudicators? Myra's expression grew complicated. That's the interesting part. While you were unconscious, 6 of them gave individual statements to the media. It's unprecedented. Adjudicators never comment during deliberation. But this whole situation is unprecedented. She pulled up her tablet, showing him the recordings. Adjudicator Thorex appeared first, his 4 legs planted firmly. In my 300 cycles of service, I have never witnessed such a display. Ambassador Drift forced us to confront our own impatience. We make judgments in minutes that affect civilizations for generations. Perhaps we should reconsider this practice. ZYX9's Mercury form rippled on screen. The human exposed a loophole in our legal framework. Some call this manipulation. I call it intelligent advocacy. Any species could have done the same. None thought to try. Serene's energy field pulsed with complexity. I entered this proceeding believing humans were careless, reckless colonizers. I leave it understanding they are thoughtful, historically informed decision makers. The 73 charges remain, but their context has changed everything. Cashin closed his eyes, processing. Show me Vailesh. The executor's crystalline form filled the screen, colors swirling in patterns Cashin had learned to read. Ambassador Drift did something remarkable, Vailesh stated. He transformed a judgment into an education. Whether this was his intent or a fortunate byproduct, the result stands. The Accord has learned more about humanity in 3 days than in the previous 10 years of formal relations. This lesson came at significant cost to all parties, but particularly to him. The recording paused, and Vailesh's colors shifted to something almost gentle. I hope he recovers fully. There is more to discuss. A soft chime echoed through the medical bay. Mira checked her tablet and paled. They're ready. The adjudicators have reached a verdict. Cashin forced himself upright, ignoring the medical AI's protests. Help me get dressed. You can't. Mira, he interrupted gently, I spent 75 hours earning the right to hear this verdict in person. I'm not going to miss it because of a little exhaustion. 10 minutes later, Cashin Drift limped back into the judgment chamber, supported by Mira on one side and a walking aide on the other. The observers' gallery erupted in applause, a sound that had never before echoed in this solemn space. The adjudicators had returned to their positions. All 17 of them, even those who'd collapsed or phased out during the testimony. They looked as exhausted as Cashin felt. Vailesh's colors formed a pattern Cashin didn't recognize. Ambassador Drift, you should be recovering. And you should be rested before delivering a verdict of this magnitude, Cashin replied. But here we are. A ripple that might have been amusement passed through Vailesh's crystalline structure. Indeed. Here we are. Shall we proceed? Cashin nodded, lowering himself carefully into the seat that Mira had brought, another unprecedented accommodation. The judgment chamber has deliberated on 73 charges against humanity's colonial practices, Vailesh began formally. Before we deliver our verdict, we acknowledge that this proceeding has been educational in ways we did not anticipate. Thorex spoke up. Ambassador Drift invoked an ancient right that we had forgotten could be used with such effect. In doing so, he exposed not only his species' reasoning but our own hasty judgment processes. Both revelations are valuable. The right of complete testimony will be revised, Serene added. Not to prevent what Ambassador Drift did, but to codify reasonable limits that balance thoroughness with practicality. This is part of living law, it adapts. ZYX9 rippled forward. But adaptability does not mean absolution. The charges still stand. Actions were taken that violated protocols. The question becomes, were these violations justified? The chamber held its breath. Vailesh's colors intensified. We have examined each charge in the context of humanity's historical and cultural framework, as comprehensively presented by Ambassador Drift. Our verdict is as follows. A pause that stretched like infinity. Charges 1 through 15 regarding governance protocols, dismissed with clarification. The Accord recognizes that different species require different administrative structures. Humanity's distributed governance model is hereby recognized as culturally appropriate. Cashin felt Myra's hand tighten on his shoulder. Charges 16 through 40, regarding colonial oversight and resource management, partially upheld. While humanity's explanations provide context, some violations represent genuine oversights. Corrective measures will be required, but punitive sanctions are waived. Reasonable. More than fair, actually. Charges 41 through 65, regarding safety protocols and emergency procedures. Dismissed. Humanity's track record of successful crisis management supports their methodological choices. The Accord will study these approaches for potential incorporation into broader protocols. The gallery was buzzing now. This was better than anyone had hoped. Charges 66 through 72, regarding frontier autonomy and reporting requirements. Reformed. The Accord will establish a new classification for autonomous settlements that recognizes legitimate self-governance while maintaining necessary communication channels. Only one charge remained. Velesh's colors shifted to the deep blue of serious consideration. Charge 73. Refusal to submit to Accord military oversight. This is the gravest charge, touching upon collective security and mutual defense. Cashin straightened despite his exhaustion. After extensive deliberation, Velesh continued, we find that humanity's concerns are not without merit. The concentration of military authority has, historically, been problematic for multiple species within the Accord. Therefore, Charge 73 is dismissed with a condition. Condition? Cashin asked. Humanity will participate in the formation of a reformed security framework, one that balances collective defense with distributed authority. You will help us build what you refuse to join. This is not punishment. This is partnership. The chamber exploded into sound, cheers, arguments, shocked exclamations from dozens of species. The verdict wasn't just about humanity. It was about reforming the Accord itself. Velesh waited for silence to return, then spoke directly to Cashin. Ambassador Drift, you came here facing expulsion from the Accord and the loss of all your colonies. You leave with acquittal on most charges, reduced penalties on others, and an invitation to help reshape our institutions. This is an extraordinary outcome. Earned through extraordinary means, Cashin replied hoarsely. Indeed, Velesh agreed. You spoke for 75 hours to teach us what we should have learned over 10 years of peaceful coexistence. This was inefficient. But effective, though Rex interjected. But effective, Velesh conceded. Ambassador, the Accord extends its respect. And its hope that future differences can be resolved through dialogue rather than endurance tests. Cashin managed a weak smile. I'll see what I can do, Executor. Though I make no promises. We humans do love to talk. Laughter rippled through the chamber, genuine, warm laughter that dissolved the last of the tension. As Mira helped Cashin to his feet, Velesh called out one final time. Ambassador? For what it's worth, that was the most impressive demonstration of sheer stubborn will I have witnessed in 3,000 cycles of Accord history. Cashin turned back, grinning despite his exhaustion. Executor, that wasn't stubbornness. That was Tuesday for a human diplomat. And with that, Cashin Drift limped out of the judgment chamber, leaving behind a verdict that would reshape the Twilight Accord and a legend that would endure for generations. The chamber had demanded silence. Humanity had brought a filibuster. And in doing so had changed everything. The ripple spread. 6 months after the verdict, Cashin Drift sat in his new office overlooking the Accord's diplomatic quarter. The view showed 17 different architectural styles from 17 species, a physical manifestation of diversity that he'd spent 75 hours defending. His body had recovered, mostly. The doctors said his vocal cords had permanent scarring. His voice would always carry that slight rasp now. Cashin considered it a badge of honor. Ambassador, Mira announced from the doorway, the Security Reformation Committee is ready for you. Cashin nodded, gathering his notes. The committee had been meeting for 4 months now, redesigning the Accord's military oversight structure. It was tedious, bureaucratic work, nothing like the dramatic showdown in the judgment chamber. But it was important work. The kind that would prevent future showdowns. How's the mood? He asked. Mira smiled. Optimistic. The Velok delegation actually agreed to your proposal about distributed command authorization. Though Rex is still arguing about response time protocols, but I think he's just enjoying the debate. As they walked through the diplomatic complex, Cashin noticed something that still surprised him. Other species representatives nodded respectfully as he passed. Some even stopped to exchange greetings. Before the trial, he'd been invisible, a representative of a junior species barely worth acknowledging. Now humans were taken seriously. The trial had gone viral across the Accord in ways no one anticipated. Footage of Cashin's marathon testimony had been edited into documentary series, analyzed in academic papers, even turned into entertainment content. There was apparently a hit musical on the Kethrin homeworld titled, The Human Who Talked Back. But beyond the spectacle, something fundamental had shifted. The Nethrek delegation sent a formal request, Mira reported as they rode the lift to the committee chambers. They want to know if you'd be willing to consult on their trade dispute with the Yulvan. They specifically requested the human approach to conflict resolution. Which is? Cashin asked, amused. In their words, exhaustive explanation until mutual understanding is achieved. Cashin laughed, then winced, his ribs still protested sudden movements. Tell them I'm honored, but maybe suggest they try conversation before conversation as endurance sport. The committee chamber was crowded when they arrived. 17 species representatives, plus observers from a dozen more. At the head of the table sat Executor Valesh, whose crystalline form had become familiar over months of collaboration. Ambassador Drift, Valesh greeted him, colors swirling in warm tones. We were discussing human military philosophy. Perhaps you could enlighten us on the concept of defense in depth? What followed was a 3-hour discussion that would have seemed impossibly tedious 6 months ago. Now it felt revolutionary. Species that had barely spoken to each other were debating strategic philosophy, sharing concerns, building frameworks together. During a break, Adjudicator Serene approached Cashin. I wanted to thank you, the energy being said simply. For what? Nearly dying of exhaustion in your chamber? For showing us we'd become complacent, Serene replied. The accord operated smoothly because we all agreed not to question the fundamentals. You questioned everything. It was uncomfortable. But necessary. Necessary, Valesh added, materializing beside them. And effective. The reforms we're implementing go beyond military oversight. We're revising judgment protocols across the board. Longer deliberation periods. Mandatory context review. Cultural liaison requirements. The drift protocols, Cashin said with a slight smile. I heard what they're being called. You object to having legal reforms named after you? Valesh asked. I object to my legacy being that guy who talked for 3 days straight, Cashin replied. There's more to diplomacy than endurance. True, Valesh acknowledged. But sometimes endurance is exactly what's needed. You stood in that chamber and forced us to hear you. Not through violence or threat, but through sheer unwillingness to stop until we understood. That's a lesson every species can learn from. The afternoon session focused on emergency response protocols. ZYX9 presented a proposal that incorporated elements from human Valok and Kethran systems. A hybrid approach that would have been unthinkable before the trial. We used to believe in standardization, ZYX9 explained. One system for all scenarios. Ambassador Drift taught us that flexibility isn't weakness. Sometimes, having 17 different approaches means one of them will work when the others fail. Though Rex clicked in agreement. The Verdant Reach plague example was illuminating. If humanity had followed our standardized protocols, 3,000 colonists would have died. Instead, they survived because one settlement tried something different. As the meeting concluded, Cashin received a priority message on his tablet. He read it quickly then smiled. Good news? Mira asked. The Colonial Initiative just approved 4 new settlement missions, Cashin replied. 2 years ago the Accord was trying to shut us down. Now we're expanding with full support. That's not just good news, Mira observed. That's vindication. That's politics, Cashin corrected gently. We're useful now. We're interesting. We're the species that broke the system and helped rebuild it better. Everyone loves a redemption story. Cynical, Mira teased. Realistic, Cashin countered. But I'll take it. Cynical success beats idealistic failure every time. That evening, Cashin attended a reception at the Kethran embassy. It was technically optional, but he'd learned that optional diplomatic functions were anything but. Besides, he genuinely enjoyed these gatherings now. 6 months ago he would have been ignored or condescended to. Tonight, he was surrounded by delegates wanting to discuss everything from human history to the fine points of colonial governance. A young Valok diplomat approached him nervously. Ambassador Drift? I'm Kelvax. I wanted to ask, how did you prepare? For the testimony, I mean. Did you memorize everything? Cashin sipped his drink, synthetic alcohol, carefully calibrated to human metabolism. I didn't memorize it, Kelvax. I lived it. I spent 10 years studying human history before I entered diplomatic service. I wanted to understand where we came from so I could help determine where we're going. 10 years, Kelvax repeated, awed. That's longer than my entire education. Different species, different timelines, Cashin said diplomatically. But the principle holds. You can't represent your people if you don't understand them. And you can't expect others to understand them if you haven't done the work yourself. Later, as the reception wound down, Valish approached him on a balcony overlooking the diplomatic quarter. "You're something of a celebrity now," the executor observed. "I'm aware," Cashin replied dryly. 3 species have requested permission to name settlements after me. I've politely declined all of them. What? Many beings would welcome such honor. Because I don't want to be famous for talking, Cashin explained. I want humanity to be respected for what we build, what we create, what we contribute. The trial was necessary. But it's over. Now comes the harder part, living up to the principles I spent 75 hours defending. Valish's colors shifted to deep, contemplative purple. You know, when you first invoked the right of complete testimony, I thought you were making a mockery of our system. By hour 20 I thought you were insane. By hour 40 I thought you were brilliant. By hour 70 I understood. Understood what? That you weren't just defending humanity's actions. You were demonstrating humanity's character. Your species doesn't give up. You exhaust every option, explore every angle, push beyond reasonable limits. That's not always wise. But it is impressive. Cashin smiled. High praise from someone who watched me nearly die of exhaustion. I would have stopped you if I could have, Valish admitted. The right of complete testimony prohibited it, but I wanted to. Watching an intelligent being destroy themselves for a principle is difficult. I wasn't destroying myself, Cashin said quietly. I was proving something. To you, to the Accord, to humanity. That we belong here. That we earned our place not through military might or economic dominance, but through sheer unwillingness to be dismissed without being heard. And you succeeded, Valish acknowledged. Perhaps too well. Now every delegation wants to invoke ancient rights and test boundaries. We've had to issue 3 clarifications just this month. Cashin laughed. Welcome to the Accord I joined, chaotic, contentious, and constantly evolving. It's messy, but it's alive. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the diplomatic quarters' lights shimmer against the evening sky. Representatives from across known space, working together, arguing together, building together. Ambassador, Valish said eventually, I have a question. A personal one. Ask. Why did you really do it? The truth, not the diplomatic answer. You could have let the Accord expel humanity. Started fresh. Built your own alliance of species. Why fight so hard to stay in a system that was judging you harshly? Cashin considered the question carefully. Because isolation is death, executor. Not physical death, cultural death. Intellectual death. The death that comes from thinking you're right because no one's around to tell you you're wrong. Humanity spent too many centuries isolated on Earth, fighting ourselves because we had no one else to fight. First Contact saved us from that. The Accord gave us a larger context, a bigger family. He turned to face Valish directly. We have flaws. We make mistakes. We do things that seem strange or reckless to other species. But we're trying. And we believe, I believe, that trying imperfectly together is better than succeeding alone. That's why I stood in that chamber for 75 hours. Because the Accord is worth fighting for even when the Accord is fighting against you. Valish's colors cycled through patterns that Cashin had learned represented deep emotional processing. You know, the executor said finally, when I first became an adjudicator 300 cycles ago, I believed my role was to maintain order, to ensure compliance, to judge deviation as error. And now I believe my role is to ensure justice. Real justice, which requires understanding context, acknowledging complexity, and accepting that different species will solve problems differently. You taught me that, Ambassador. You and your impossible, exhausting, brilliant testimony. Mira appeared at the balcony entrance. Cashin, the Colonial Initiative Director, is asking for a call. Something about the frontier expansion proposal. Cashin nodded, then extended his hand to Valish in the human gesture of farewell. The executor's crystalline structure shifted to approximate a limb, completing the gesture awkwardly but sincerely. Until next time, Ambassador. Until next time, Executor. As Cashin walked back into the reception hall, he caught his reflection in a decorative panel. He looked older than his 42 years. The trial had aged him, the responsibility had weathered him. But his eyes were bright and his posture was confident. He'd come to the Twilight Accord as a junior diplomat representing a species barely respected. He'd faced expulsion and judgment. He'd stood for 75 hours without rest, without pause, without yielding. And he'd won. Not just the trial. Not just the verdict, but something bigger: respect, understanding, and a place at the table for humanity's voice. The chamber had demanded silence. They'd brought a filibuster. And in doing so, they'd changed the entire conversation. 3 months later, at a ceremony establishing the reformed security framework, Cashin Drift delivered a speech that lasted exactly 7 minutes. A deliberate, pointed brevity that made the entire assembly laugh. "I've learned," he concluded, "that sometimes the best diplomacy is knowing when to stop talking. Thank you and good evening." As applause filled the chamber, the same chamber where he'd nearly died of exhaustion, Cashin smiled. Humanity had found its place among the stars. And he'd helped put them there, one exhausting word at a time.